Joran Vale's fingers drummed against the observation deck railing as he watched the atmospheric readings cascade across the holographic display. The numbers pulsed in steady rhythm: oxygen saturation at 94%, particulate density within acceptable range, pressure differential holding stable. All normal. All predictable. Exactly how he preferred it. Outside the reinforced windows of processing station Theta 9, Kepler 442b's atmosphere churned with violent beauty. Purple-tinged clouds rolled across the darkened sky, split occasionally by forks of crimson lightning that illuminated the toxic fog below. The storm had been building for hours, a massive weather system that would keep most colonists sealed in their habitat domes for the next 2 days at minimum. Perfect weather for a night shift, Joran thought, taking a long drink from his thermos. The coffee was bitter and lukewarm, but he barely noticed anymore. Comfort had become synonymous with routine somewhere along the way, and routine meant solitude. No team members to coordinate with, no supervisors checking his work, no forced small talk during shift changes. Just him, the machines, and the endless data streams that required nothing more than his technical expertise. The chronometer on his wrist showed 3:17 Standard Time. Another 4 hours until Hendricks arrived for the day rotation. 4 more hours of blessed silence in his climate-controlled tower above the chaos. The sound, when it came, was so unexpected that Joran nearly dropped his thermos. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the station's lower level, distinct even over the ambient hum of processors and ventilation systems. He froze, his mind immediately running through possibilities. The external doors were sealed against the toxic atmosphere. They had to be. No one could survive outside without a full environmental suit, and the nearest habitat cluster was 17 kilometers northeast. Even with proper equipment, traveling through a storm this severe would be suicide. The knocking came again. 3 deliberate beats that seemed to carry through the metal walls with impossible clarity. Joran set down his thermos carefully and pulled up the security feeds on his tablet. The main entrance cameras showed nothing but swirling gas and debris. Secondary airlock feeds revealed the same emptiness. He cycled through each external camera systematically, his pulse quickening with each empty frame. Then he reached the auxiliary emergency port. A figure huddled against the door, barely visible through the storm interference. The camera quality was poor, but Joran could make out what appeared to be someone wrapped in improvised environmental protection plastic sheeting. A crude respirator cobbled together from salvaged parts. Clothing that looked more like desperation than design. Every protocol he'd ever learned screamed at him to alert colony security. Unauthorized personnel. Possible contamination. Security breach. The list of regulations he'd be violating. By opening that door scrolled through his mind with bureaucratic precision, but something about the figure's posture, the way they slumped against the door, as if it were the only thing keeping them upright, made him hesitate. Joran found his feet moving toward the auxiliary port before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision. The emergency airlock was cramped, designed for maintenance access rather than personnel transfer. His hands moved across the control panel with practiced efficiency, initiating the decontamination sequence. Through the thick porthole window, he watched the outer door cycle open. The figure practically fell into the airlock chamber, moving with the jerky desperation of someone fighting to remain conscious. The decontamination mist flooded the small space, and as it cleared, Joran got his first clear look at his unexpected visitor. She was humanoid, but distinctly not human. Her skin held a subtle blue-green tint that seemed to shift in the harsh LED lighting, like sunlight playing across deep water. Silver hair hung in damp tangles past her shoulders, and when she looked up toward the inner window, her eyes were large and dark, not quite black, but a deep indigo that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even through her exhaustion, There was something striking about her features, an otherworldly elegance that made his breath catch. Her improvised suit was falling apart, held together with salvaged tape and what looked like sheer determination. As she struggled to her knees, pieces of plastic sheeting peeled away, revealing a standard utility jumpsuit beneath that had seen better days. The inner door hissed open, and she collapsed onto the metal flooring, gasping. Her breathing was labored, but steady. The atmosphere mixture was compatible, at least. "Please," she said, and her voice carried a melodic quality despite her obvious exhaustion, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "I have 3 credits. Standard currency. I need shelter. Somewhere safe until the storm passes." Joran stared down at her, his mind racing through the implications. Harboring undocumented visitors was a serious violation. His job, his security clearance, the carefully constructed isolation he'd built over 3 years, all of it could vanish with one core decision. Colony administration didn't tolerate protocol breaches, especially not when it came to security, but she was looking up at him with those strange, captivating eyes, and he could see her fighting not to shake with cold and fear. There was something in her expression, raw vulnerability mixed with stubborn pride that bypassed every rational argument his mind was constructing. "How did you get here?" he asked, crouching down to her level. "The nearest settlement is 17.3 kilometers northeast," she finished, her voice hoarse. "I walked. Took me 7 hours through the storm. Your station broadcasts on emergency frequencies. I followed the signal. 7 hours. Through a toxic storm that could strip flesh from bone." Joran felt something twist in his chest. She fumbled with what remained of her protective gear, her movements clumsy with exhaustion. Her fingers were elegant and longer than human proportions, with a subtle webbing between them that caught the light. From her makeshift pocket, she extracted a small credit chip, holding it toward him with trembling hands. 3 credits, she repeated, and there was such desperate hope in her voice that it hurt to hear. "It's all I have left, please." Joran looked at the chip, a small, worn piece of technology that represented everything she had in the universe, then back at her face. Behind the alien features, he recognized something achingly familiar. The expression of someone who had run out of options, who was asking for help from a stranger, because there was literally nowhere else to turn. He'd seen that expression in his own mirror. Years ago. "Keep your credits," he said, standing and offering her his hand. "Come on. Let's get you warmed up." She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Her indigo eyes searched his face, looking for the catch, the condition, the price that would inevitably come. When she finally took his hand, her fingers were surprisingly warm against his palm despite her ordeal. He helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed slightly before finding her balance. "I'm Joran," he said as he led her deeper into the station, supporting her weight as she leaned against him. "Nira," she replied, and even through her exhaustion, he could hear the gratitude threading through her voice. "Thank you. I wasn't sure anyone would." "The shower's this way," Joran said, cutting off what sounded like it might become an emotional moment. He wasn't good with emotions, his own or anyone else's. That was part of why he'd chosen this job. Water's recycled but clean. There should be spare clothes in the emergency locker that might fit. As they walked through the sterile corridors of the processing station, Joran caught glimpses of her in the polished metal surfaces. She moved with a fluid grace despite her exhaustion, and when lightning from the storm briefly illuminated the windows, her skin seemed to pulse with a subtle bioluminescence. Like deep-sea creatures he'd seen in nature documentaries, he realized he was staring and forced himself to focus on practical matters. Where she would sleep, what he would tell Hendricks if the day shift supervisor arrived early. How he would explain the presence of an undocumented visitor to colony control if they discovered her dot, but beneath the practical concerns, something else stirred a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. A sense that his carefully ordered world was about to become significantly more complicated. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, that prospect didn't fill him with dread. The shower room door slid open with a soft hiss. Steam from the processing systems had already fogged the mirror. Nira stood in the doorway, still clutching her 3 credits like a talisman, still looking at him as if he might change his mind at any moment. "Take your time," Joran said softly. "I'll be in the main control room when you're ready." She nodded, those dark indigo eyes never leaving his face. "Joran," she said as he turned to go. "Why? Why help me?" He paused, considering the question. The honest answer, that he recognized the look of someone with nowhere else to turn, that her desperation had called to something he'd tried to bury years ago, seemed too personal to share with a stranger. Even a beautiful, mysterious stranger who had walked 17 kilometers through a toxic storm to knock on his door. "Because you asked," he said instead, and left her to find whatever comfort she could in hot water and clean clothes. Back in the control room, Joran stared at his monitoring stations without really seeing them. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. His sanctuary had been breached. His isolation ended by 3 simple knocks and a plea for basic decency. He found himself listening for the sound of running water, wondering about the story behind those exhausted eyes, and trying not to think about how long it had been since he'd shared his space with another living being. The shower ran for a long time, and Joran discovered he didn't mind the sound at all. Joren woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in his quarters. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't place where he was or why his neck ached. Then memory flooded back. He'd fallen asleep at his monitoring station, something he hadn't done in months. The soft rustle of fabric and gentle clink of dishes reminded him that his solitary existence had been interrupted by storm and circumstance. Nira stood at the small kitchenette, her back to him as she worked with quiet efficiency. She'd found the emergency clothing locker, and the standard issue gray jumpsuit hung loose on her slender frame, the sleeves rolled up several times to accommodate her shorter stature. Her silver hair, now clean and dry, caught the morning light streaming through the observation windows like strands of moonlight. The storm had passed during the night, leaving Kepler 442b's sky a brilliant amber dotted with high, wispy clouds. "You don't have to do that," Joran said, sitting up and running his hands through his disheveled hair. His back protested the night spent in his chair, muscles stiff and complaining. She turned, and he was struck again by how different she looked, clean and rested. Her skin held that subtle blue-green tint more vibrantly now, and there were delicate patterns along her temples and neck that resembled scales but moved like living art when she smiled, fluid, responsive to her emotions in ways he found mesmerizing. "I couldn't sleep," she said, gesturing toward the food processor with an apologetic shrug. "Your rehydration units are more sophisticated than anything we had on the mining platforms. I thought I'd make breakfast as a thank you." Joran stood, stretching carefully. "Mining platforms?" A shadow crossed her features, dimming the bioluminescent patterns on her skin. "Where I came from, before ... She turned back to the food processor, focusing intently on the steaming bowls she was preparing. "It's not important." But it was important. Joran realized with sudden clarity that everything about her was important in a way that made his chest feel tight and his carefully constructed emotional barriers feel suddenly fragile. He'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of not caring, of treating his job as nothing more than data points and routine maintenance. Yet here was Nira, moving through his sterile quarters like she belonged there, and he found himself wanting to know every detail of her story. "Try this," she said, offering him a bowl. The contents looked like standard protein porridge, the kind that tasted like nutritious cardboard regardless of which flavor setting you selected. But when he tasted it, complex flavors bloomed across his tongue, something floral and sweet, with an underlying earthiness he couldn't identify. There were notes of spice and what might have been citrus, all woven together in a way that made the bland protein base taste almost gourmet. "How did you do that?" he asked, genuinely surprised. "The food processors don't have these flavor profiles programmed." Neera's smile was shy but pleased, and he noticed the patterns on her skin brighten slightly, shifting from blue-green to hints of warm gold. "Spices," she said, pulling a small weathered pouch from her jumpsuit pocket. "I've been carrying seeds and dried roots from home since I left. They still work with human food." Home. The word hung between them, loaded with implication and unspoken loss. Joran sat across from her at the small table, noting how she kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting something or someone to appear on the horizon. "Where is home?" he asked gently. She was quiet for so long, he thought she wouldn't answer. Her fingers traced abstract patterns on the table's surface, the webbing between them catching the light. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Kepler 186F, a mining colony on Proxima Station." Her fingers stilled. "Was home. Until the corporate wars reached us." Joran knew about the corporate wars, distant conflicts between mega corporations fighting over resource rights and territorial claims. The news feeds mentioned them occasionally, but they seemed abstract, removed from the day-to-day reality of atmospheric processing and maintenance schedules. Just numbers and political rhetoric that didn't touch his isolated tower. "What happened?" he asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Neera's dark indigo eyes met his, and he saw depths of pain that made his own self-imposed isolation seem trivial by comparison. There was trauma there, layers of it, carefully controlled but never fully healed. "Consolidated Mining decided our asteroid belt was worth more than our lives," she said with bitter precision. "They couldn't legally remove an established colony. Too much paperwork, too many witnesses, so they manufactured a safety crisis. Sabotaged our air processors, contaminated the water supply, then offered to evacuate us to temporary facilities while they fixed the problems." She took a sip from her own bowl, and Joran noticed her hands trembling slightly. The patterns on her skin had darkened to deep blue, almost black. The temporary facilities were labor camps. Work quotas, restricted movement, communication blackouts. They separated families, assigned us to different shifts so we couldn't organize. Said it was for efficiency. Her laugh was hollow, painful to hear. "Took us 6 months to realize they'd already stripped our home bare. Nothing left to go back to. The colony didn't exist anymore, just empty buildings and depleted mines." Joran felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard rumors of corporate exploitation, of colonies that disappeared from registry databases, but he'd always assumed there were protections, oversight, someone who cared. "How did you escape?" "I didn't escape," Neera said quietly, setting down her bowl. "I survived." "There's a difference." She stood abruptly, walking to the observation windows. Morning light painted her profile in gold and amber, making the living patterns on her skin shimmer like water disturbed by wind. Joran followed, giving her space but close enough that she knew he was listening. "The labor ship transporting us to a new facility had mechanical failures, real ones this time. Not sabotage." Her voice was steady now, matter of fact in the way of someone who had told this story before, who had learned to distance themselves from the horror of it. Life support started failing. The corporate overseers took the only functioning escape pods. All of them. She pressed her palm against the glass, and Joran saw her fingers curl into a fist. Left 200 of us to die in space. No distress beacon, no emergency protocols, nothing. Just ... Expendable assets being written off. But you didn't die, Joran said softly, moving closer. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself together through sheer force of will. Emergency protocols activated automatically. The ship's I bless whatever programmer gave it ethics coding jettisoned cargo pods with basic life support to reduce mass and extend power. She turned to face him, and he was struck by the raw honesty in her eyes. 50 of us made it into those pods before the main ship lost atmosphere. We drifted for 8 days before a salvage crew found us. 8 days, Joran breathed, trying to imagine it. 8 days in a cargo pod, not knowing if rescue would ever come, watching oxygen levels drop while surrounded by the bodies of those who didn't make it. 12 survivors, Nira continued. Out of 50. Out of 200. The patterns on her skin pulsed with emotion, grief, anger, survivor's guilt, all bleeding together in shifting colors. The salvage crew was pragmatic. They couldn't afford to transport refugees for free, but they needed workers. So we worked our passage, system by system, picking up odd jobs and trying to earn enough credits for legitimate transport. She pulled the small credit chip from her pocket, turning it over in her palm. The morning light made it glint like a broken promise. That was 18 months ago. I've been working my way toward the outer colonies ever since, hoping to find somewhere that doesn't ask too many questions about documentation. Somewhere beyond corporate reach. Joran studied her face, the determined set of her jaw, the way she held herself despite the obvious exhaustion and trauma. She was stronger than anyone had a right to be after what she'd endured. And beautiful, he realized, in a way that had nothing to do with her alien features and everything to do with the person she'd remained, despite everything trying to break her. The storm last night, he said carefully. You weren't just seeking shelter. You were running. She nodded slowly, and he saw fear flash across her features before she could mask it. The transport I was working on got raided by corporate security 3 days ago. Looking for stolen property, their term for escaped workers. I grabbed what I could and ran. 3 credits, Joran said, looking at the chip in her hand. Everything you have left from 18 months of trying to rebuild a life. Everything, she confirmed, her voice barely audible. The weight of her story settled over them like a physical presence. Joran thought about his own reasons for choosing isolation. A failed relationship. A tragic accident he'd witnessed. The crushing weight of feeling responsible for others. His past traumas had driven him to seek solitude and safety in routine. But Nira's pain made his own seem almost luxurious by comparison. He'd had the privilege of choosing his isolation. Hers had been forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control, by people who saw her as nothing more than a line item in a profit calculation. You can't stay here, he said, hating the words even as he spoke them. Not officially. The colony runs identification checks every week. And if corporate security is looking for you. I know, she said quietly, turning back to the window. I'm not asking for permanent sanctuary, Joran. Just ... time. Time to figure out what comes next. Maybe earn enough for transport to the rim colonies, somewhere beyond corporate reach, if such a place exists. Joran found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the implications. How long? A few days? A week at most? She met his eyes, and there was such vulnerability in her expression that it made his heart ache. I know I'm asking a lot. If they catch me here, you could lose your job, face charges for harboring an undocumented person. I understand if you can't take that risk. I wouldn't think less of you. You've already done more than anyone had a right to expect. But even as she said it, Joran knew his decision was already made. Maybe it was the way she'd trusted him enough to share her story, or the careful way she moved through his space as if afraid to disturb anything, or simply the fact that for the first time in years, his quarters didn't feel empty. Maybe it was all of those things, or maybe it was something simpler, a growing realization that he didn't want her to leave. "The day shift arrives in 3 hours," he said, watching hope kindle in her eyes like a flame catching. "We'll need to be careful. Hendricks, the day supervisor, he's thorough. But the night rotation gives us time. You can hide in the maintenance quarters during the day. They're accessed through the lower levels, away from the main station." "Thank you," Nira said, and there were tears in her eyes now, held back by sheer willpower. I can't." "You don't have to say anything," Joran interrupted, afraid that if she started crying, something in his own carefully maintained composure would crack. "Just make more of that breakfast tomorrow? With your spices?" She laughed a real laugh this time, bright and genuine, and the patterns on her skin burst into brilliant golds and warm greens. "It's a deal." They stood there at the window, watching Kepler 442b's strange sky shift through morning colors, and Joran felt something shift inside him too. The walls he'd built around his heart over 3 years of isolation felt suddenly thinner, more permeable. Dangerous dot, but as he glanced at Nira and saw her smiling at the amber sky, he found he didn't mind the danger nearly as much as he should have.